The Whispering River. Chapter 1. The Land and the Farmer. The sun burned high over the fields of Kuta, a quiet village nestled between golden grasslands and dense forests. Here, the soil was rich, the seasons predictable, and the people lived by the rhythm of the earth. One of these people was Bako, a farmer known for his patience with the land. He had inherited his small farm from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. Bako's days began before dawn, his hands sinking into the cool earth before the heat of the day took over. He had little need for distractions. His farm provided all he required. He was neither the richest man in Kuta nor the poorest, but he was content. But contentment has a way of inviting curiosity. For years, the elders warned against wandering too far beyond the hills that bordered the village. "The land beyond does not belong to us," they would say. "It has its own masters." Bako, ever the practical man, never questioned this wisdom. He had no reason to. Until the drought came. Chapter 2. The First Whisper. The rain had always been faithful to Kuta. It came when it was needed, nourishing the millet and yams, filling the rivers and wells. But this year, the sky had turned its back on them. Days stretched into weeks, then into months, without a drop of rain. The river that snaked through the village, once full of life, had shrunk to a sluggish, muddy trickle. The village elders held meetings, the women prayed, the children grew thin. Bako's crops, like those of his neighbors, withered in the heat. One evening, as he sat by his dying field, wiping sweat from his brow, he heard something, a whisper. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, yet distinct. "Come closer." Bako turned sharply. There was no one, just the empty fields, the setting sun, and the far-off stretch of hills that the elders warned against. He shook his head. The drought was playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it again. "Come closer, Bako." His heart pounded. He had told no one of the strange whisper, but that night his dreams were filled with it. A voice, sweet as ripe fruit, calling his name. A river, shimmering under moonlight, full to the brim while all other waters had run dry. When he woke, he made a decision. He would go beyond the hills. Chapter 3. Beyond the Hills. Bako had always been a cautious man, but desperation dulls caution. Before dawn, he gathered his water gourd, a small sack of dried millet cakes, and his machete, then set off toward the hills. The land beyond Kuta was unfamiliar, its silence unnatural. The trees here were taller, their trunks gnarled like ancient fingers reaching skyward. The further he walked, the more the air thickened not with heat, but with something unseen. A feeling that the world was holding its breath. Then he heard it again. "Closer, Bako. You are almost here." His feet moved before his mind could object. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. The river appeared suddenly, winding like a silver serpent through the land. It was impossibly full, its waters clear and inviting. Birds that had disappeared from Kuta chirped merrily in the trees, and along the riverbanks, yams and plantains grew wild, untouched by drought. Bako fell to his knees. How was this possible? He dipped his fingers into the water. It was cool, fresh. "Drink." The voice was no longer a whisper but a melody, weaving through the rustling leaves and the hum of insects. Bako hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But thirst was a cruel master. He scooped a handful of water to his lips. It tasted like rain, sweet and crisp, and for a moment, everything else faded. The dying crops, the hunger, the worries. He drank again, deeper this time. Then he saw her. A woman stood across the river, her skin glowing like moonlight on water. Her hair cascaded down her back in thick, dark braids, adorned with golden beads that shimmered even in the shade. Her eyes, deep as the river itself, watched him with an unreadable expression. "Who are you?" Bako asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled. "I have many names." Bako felt his limbs grow light, his head dizzy. The world around him shimmered, colors twisting in ways they should not. The river was showing him something. Visions danced before his eyes, fields lush with green, fruit heavy on trees, children laughing as they ran through golden harvests. Kuda, thriving, his farm, no longer dry and lifeless, but bursting with abundance. He could bring this water back. He could save his people. But deep inside him, a warning pulsed. Something about this was wrong. Then the woman spoke again. "All this can be yours," she said, stepping closer. The river did not ripple as she moved. "If you are willing to stay." Bako's breath caught. Stay? The illusion flickered, and for the briefest moment, he saw something else. The river was not silver but black, its depths unfathomable. The fruit along the banks was not ripe but rotting, flies buzzing over it, and the woman. Her face was no longer beautiful. Her smile was too wide, her teeth too sharp. Bako stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The river was not a blessing. It was a trap. Chapter 4. The Illusion Cracks. Bako's breath came in short, sharp gasps. His legs felt unsteady, as though the earth beneath him had softened into mud. The woman watched him, her smile no longer warm but knowing. "Why do you hesitate?" she asked, tilting her head. "You wanted water, did you not?" Bako forced himself to step back, but the moment he did, the air around him shifted. The sky darkened, the once cheerful chirping of birds twisted into something distorted like laughter, but hollow, wrong. He blinked, and suddenly the village of Kuda appeared before him, but not as he had left it. The fields were green again, the river full. Children played along the banks, their mothers gathering water in clay pots. He saw his own farm, vibrant with golden millet and plump yams. His heart clenched. It was everything he wanted. He turned to call out, to run forward. Then he saw them. The villagers' faces were wrong. Their eyes, once bright, were empty pools of black. Their smiles stretched too wide, too fixed. The children's laughter came in eerie unison, a sound without joy. A chill ran down his spine. This is not real. The woman stepped beside him. "It can be," she whispered. "Stay, and it will all be yours." Bako clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The pain was real. His heartbeat hammering in his ears was real. The river was lying. His vision flickered, the village shimmered, like heat rising from the ground. He saw glimpses of the truth of barren landscape, skeletal trees stretching toward a sky devoid of color. The river, once silver and full, twisted into a gaping maw, its surface whirling with shadowy figures. Bako stumbled back another step. The woman's smile faltered. "You cannot leave." The world around him trembled. The river's whisper became a roar, and suddenly, hands cold, wet hands erupted from the water, reaching for him. Bako turned and ran. "Let me know if you want even more intensity, or if you'd like a bit of breathing room before the next wave of danger." Chapter 5. The Escape. Bako ran, his feet pounding against the earth, his breath ragged. The trees blurred past him as he scrambled up the hillside, away from the river's edge. The whispers still chased him, slithering through the air, but they grew fainter with each step. Only when he reached the crest of the hill did he dare to stop. His chest heaved as he collapsed onto the dry grass, his body trembling. He turned to look back. The river was still there, gleaming deceptively under the rising sun. It looked peaceful and changed, as though it had not just tried to consume him. Had he imagined it? He rubbed his arms, still feeling the phantom touch of those cold, grasping hands. His nails were caked with dirt where he had dug them into his palms. His throat was dry, his limbs heavy. Bako closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. What was that place? The elders had always warned about the land beyond the hills, but they had never spoken of this. If they knew, why had they kept silent, or had the river claimed those who had ventured too far before him? He shuddered. One thing was certain: he could not tell the others. Who would believe him that he had seen a woman who was not a woman? That the river had tried to trap him with visions of a life too perfect to be real? They would think he had gone mad from the drought. He could not risk it. But even as he resolved to put distance between himself and that cursed place, something gnawed at him. The river was full. While Kuta suffered, while their wells dried and their crops wilted, that river flowed, untouched by the drought. And it was waiting. Bako swallowed hard, then forced himself to stand. His legs still felt weak, but he had to move. He had to pretend none of this had happened. For now. Chapter 6. The Unseen Thread. Bako returned to Kuta just as the first light of dawn touched the rooftops. The village was quiet, the air thick with the scent of dust and dried earth. A few women moved sluggishly toward the well, their clay pots balanced on their heads, but their faces were heavy with exhaustion. No one noticed him slip back into his hut. He splashed cool water onto his face, trying to shake the weight of what had happened. He needed to focus on the present, his farm, his survival. The river was behind him. He had escaped. And yet, that night, Bako dreamed of water. It rushed around him, cool and endless, its currents wrapping around his ankles like silk. He heard laughter, soft and beckoning, and when he turned, she was there, the woman from the river. Her eyes gleamed like starlit pools. "Come back, Bako." His feet moved forward, the water rising around him. The cool touch soothed his sunburned skin, easing the aches in his body. It would be so easy to let go, to sink into it, too. Bako jolted awake. His body was drenched in sweat, his heartbeat pounding like a drum. He sat up, gasping. His throat was dry, his lips cracked. He reached for his water gourd, but when he raised it to his lips, it was empty. A chill crawled down his spine. He could still taste the river on his tongue. Bako shuddered and pushed himself up, pacing the small space of his hut. It was just a dream, that was all. A lingering memory of the river, nothing more. But outside, in the distance, he swore he could hear it. A whisper, soft, persistent, waiting. Chapter 7. The Pull. Days passed, but the sense of unease lingered. Bako could no longer look at the horizon without seeing the faint shimmer of the river in his mind's eye. Every time he ventured outside, the air seemed to hum with a strange, otherworldly energy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It was subtle at first, nothing more than an odd moment when his hands would itch to touch water, or when he would catch himself staring off toward the hills, the river's direction. But soon, it became something more. One evening, as Bako worked the field, his gaze drifted toward the distant line of trees. The sun had begun to set, casting the land in a warm orange glow. And then, it happened again. The whisper. B-A-A-K-O ... This time, it wasn't soft. It was insistent, urgent. He froze, his spade stilling in the ground as his heart skipped a beat. He had heard it loud and clear. The river. The woman's voice. He looked toward the hills, his throat dry. His instincts screamed at him to stay away, to turn back, but his feet against his will began to move. It was the pull of the river deep inside him now, like an invisible thread, drawing him in. Bako stopped halfway to the path. "What is wrong with me?" he muttered to himself. His mind raced as he turned in the opposite direction, but his legs refused to listen. He couldn't shake the thought that the river was calling to him, waiting patiently for his return. He cursed himself. His heart beat faster now, his pulse quickening. The deeper he tried to bury the feeling, the stronger it grew, as though the river had sunk roots deep into his soul. With a strained breath, Bako forced himself to stop, planting his feet firmly into the ground. He focused on the earth beneath him, the feel of it cold and solid, the familiar weight of his spade in his hand. "Focus," he whispered, trying to still his thoughts. "You must not go." He could hear the whisper again, but it wasn't in the air this time. It was in his head, as though the river had claimed his thoughts entirely. "Come, Bako, come to me." Bako gripped his spade tighter, the cold metal biting into his skin. His vision blurred for a moment, and he swore he saw flashes of the river against its shimmering surface, its inviting edges. Then the woman appeared in his mind, her smile, now gentle, beckoning him forward. It would be so easy to give in, to walk back to the river and drink from its cool depths again. It promised relief, promised salvation. But Baco had seen the truth. The illusion of the river, like the hunger for a rainstorm, was a false promise, a dangerous lie. With a final, desperate effort, he clenched his eyes shut and forced his mind to break free. His breath came in harsh gasps as the images faded away. It had been close, too close. Chapter 8, The Whispering Night. The days that followed were an exercise in exhaustion. Baco worked his land with a frantic intensity, his hands raw and callous from the constant labor. Every time his mind wandered, the river was there, just out of reach, its pull gentle, like a lover's call, yet suffocating in its persistence. He began to lose sleep. Every night, the whispers came, soft at first, like a breeze moving through the trees, but growing louder as the hours passed. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, the voice was unmistakable, clear and soothing. Baco. He would wake, drenched in sweat, his body trembling with the echo of her voice in his head. Each time, he could feel the pull more deeply, as though it was woven into the very fabric of his being, growing stronger by the hour. The river wasn't done with him. One evening, after a long day spent in the fields, Baco sat on the edge of his small hut, staring at the dry landscape before him. His gaze kept drifting toward the hills, toward the forest's edge, where the river lay hidden. He could almost feel it calling him. The woman's image flashed before his eyes. He squeezed them shut, trying to block out the vision of her face, glowing and serene, waiting for him. "You cannot run from me forever." The voice was so clear, so near, that he spun around, expecting to see her standing behind him. But there was no one. Only the breeze, only the weight of the silence. Baco stood up, his legs stiff, his thoughts scattered, his heart thundered in his chest. He knew that if he did not act soon, the river would pull him in for good. It would wrap its watery tendrils around him, and he would be lost forever in its depths. He couldn't let that happen. But how could he fight something that existed inside him now? He thought of the elders, their cryptic warnings, their careful words about the land beyond the hills. He thought of their stories of those who had gone to the river and never returned, their names forgotten, their bodies claimed by the water. Baco's breath quickened, and he suddenly felt very small in the vastness of the land. "It is a curse," he whispered, the weight of his realization pressing down on him. The river was not just a place, it was something older, something darker, and its grip had begun to wrap itself around him like a slow, tightening noose. The illusions, the woman, the dreams, they were all part of its plan to draw him back into its depths. Baco was its prey, and no matter how hard he fought, the river would not let him go. Chapter 9, The Final Current. Baco could no longer escape the pull of the river. He could feel it in his bones now, the weight of it, a constant, unrelenting pressure. His every thought was clouded with visions of that shimmering surface, the woman's smile, the false promise of peace that had lured him in once before. The whisper came again, this time louder, sharper, as though it had grown tired of waiting. Baco ... His body ached from the struggle, from the sleepless nights, from the constant tension that had stolen all his strength. He had tried to bury the thoughts, to silence the voice, but it was as if the river had become a part of him, its current flowing through his veins. He stood at the edge of the village, looking out toward the hills one last time. The line seemed to stretch on forever, but his eyes were drawn to the spot where the trees met the sky, the place where the river waited. He had no more strength to fight. Baco turned and began walking. It was not a conscious choice anymore. It was a compulsion, a final surrender to the inevitable. His feet moved toward the river, his body as though carried by the very current that had been pulling him all along. The line seemed to blur as he walked, his thoughts foggy, his mind no longer his own. The whisper followed him, a constant companion urging him onward, deeper into the forest. He knew on some level that he should turn back, that his life, his village, everything was slipping away. But the river had woven itself so deeply into him that he could no longer see any path other than the one it offered. When he reached the river's edge, the water was as he had seen it before, clear, shimmering, and inviting. The woman stood on the other side, waiting for him, her arms outstretched, her smile calm and knowing. "Welcome home, Baco." His legs trembled, but he stepped forward, his feet sinking into the cool water, the current wrapping around his ankles, then his knees, pulling him in with an irresistible force. He could feel the river's power surging through him, drowning out everything else, his doubts, his fears, his memories. He was already halfway across when the ground beneath him shifted, the illusion beginning to crack. The water, once so clear, turned black, swirling with shadows. The woman's face contorted, her smile stretching unnaturally wide, her teeth gleaming sharp and cruel. Baco's heart raced as he realized the truth too late. The river had never offered salvation. It had only ever wanted one thing, him. The pull became stronger, faster. He tried to fight, tried to turn back, but the current was too much, dragging him deeper into its embrace. He gasped for air, but it was no use. His lungs filled with the cold, suffocating water, and his vision blurred. For a brief moment, Baco thought of Kuta, the village, the people, the life he had left behind. He thought of the sun setting over the fields, of his father's hands in the soil, of the warmth of the earth beneath him. But those thoughts were fading now, slipping away like the land that had once been his. As the river claimed him, Baco understood. The river had always been waiting for him. It had always been calling. And now it had taken him for good. Epilogue: The Silent Current. Days passed in Kuta, then weeks, and eventually months. The drought, though fierce, had eventually lifted, as all things do. The fields of Kuta grew green once more, and the river, though smaller now, flowed steadily, as it had for generations. But Baco was never seen again. The elders spoke in hushed voices about the strange disappearance, about the warning that they had always kept. Some said the river had claimed him, others believed the spirits of the land had taken him for disturbing the balance. But in the quiet of the night, when the wind whispered through the trees, some still heard the faintest echo of Baco's name carried on the current of the river. And far beneath the surface, the woman's smile remained, waiting.
Forget to like and subscribe.